Fire Away tackles burning questions and hot topics in Canadian employment law, human resources, and dispute resolution. Hosted by Rudner Law, Fire Away is your go-to source for legal insight on the world of work. So whether you are an employee or an employer, a lawyer or an HR pro, let's ignite the conversation and get into today's episode. Here's your host, employment lawyer, mediator, and founder of Rudner Law, Stuart Rudner.
Welcome to Season 7, Episode 10 of Fire Away. I am very excited today to be joined by Alex Gonçalves of Rippling. We're going to have Rippling, by the way, is a workforce management software company, and Alex is the leader of the Canadian units. We're going to be talking about corporate credit card use and more specifically, corporate credit card fraud, how to detect it, how to prevent it, and how to handle it when it does happen. So, Alex, let's get to this. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
It should be a great discussion. I'm looking forward to it. As regular viewers and listeners know, I spent far too much of my career talking about just cause for dismissal, which of course can take a variety of forms, but one of them is theft or fraud. And we actually had a great credit card case about a year ago that I'm sure we'll talk about. So before we get into that, why don't you tell me a bit about and tell our viewers a bit about yourself and about Rippling?
Yeah, for sure. So obviously, Alex Gonçalves, I lead Rippling here in Canada. I've been in the HR software world for almost 20 years in a variety of different capacities. So I get to have the exciting job of leading Rippling for Canada here most recently. So Rippling, for those who don't know, workforce management platform, as you alluded to, Stuart, at the top of the call. We sort of end to end are an all-in-one workforce management platform, which really encompasses payroll, HR, IT, and then spend management, which obviously is a topic of conversation today around corporate cards, corporate card fraud, things like that, preventing that sort of thing using automation through a system like Rippling. So we have more than 20,000 customers globally. Our Canadian clients include companies like Neo Financial, Touch Bistro, Manulift. So super excited to be here with you today.
Yeah, thanks again for joining me. And I'm very curious because I find sometimes these issues come up in my practice or in the cases that I read about, but they're usually very low tech fraud. Typically it's the salesperson or the executive who takes their partner out for dinner and puts it on the company credit card. And somehow or other, somebody notices something unusual and they flag that. But I suspect that 98% of the time they don't even notice and it just goes under the radar. Just based on our previous conversation, I know that there's a lot more intricate ways to defraud companies, and you shared one of them last week. We'll talk more about it today, and more intricate ways to detect these things. So I'll turn it over to you just to talk a bit about how people are engaging in this corporate credit card fraud, and then we can talk about how they get discovered.
Yeah, for sure. I've seen everything under the sun in terms of corporate card fraud in my time, sort of the HR software world. And being an executive myself, obviously, I've had corporate cards myself in the various roles that I've had, and I've had employees have corporate cards as well. And so I've been not directly involved in any sort of investigations, but sort of adjacent to them in some of the businesses that I've been a part of, and seen some really interesting ways of people misappropriating and misusing corporate cards and company funds. One of the ways that I've seen, which is probably the one that you were alluding to earlier, is an executive in finance using corporate cards to purchase Apple products and then sell them.
That's the one.
And subsequently sell them on the side and create a little business for herself. And so, the only way that was actually detected is Apple reaching out and saying, "Hey, thanks for being one of our premier customers." And the CFO saying, "Well, what do you mean? We were one of your premier customers. I don't think we buy that much product from you guys." And basically it came out where she was just allocating different budgets across the different departments to the different corporate cards that she had access to. And she was unfortunately a VP of finance, so she had full access to that sort of thing. And so made for a very hairy situation for that business, for sure.
Yeah, and I love that you get the call from Apple saying thanks for being a great customer. But again, it's just another example of how they never would have known, or probably never would have known, but for that. Um, I'm curious in that case, to the extent you can talk about it, when they actually confronted that woman, how did that go?
Yeah, so this, I mean, this is actually a fairly well-known, I think, um, facing issue that happened with a company called Point Click Care here in Canada. And so, the way I understand it is Apple reached out to them. The CFO then started to do sort of like an investigation internally into how this all came to be. And the way it happened was every time there was a surplus in budget in any single department, so you would essentially use the corporate cards to then max out what that budget was in that current month and then purchase a bunch of different Apple products, whether it's MacBooks or iPads or whatever it is, and then subsequently sell them on the black market, let's say. And I think, when she was confronted, it was pretty black and white what was going on. And so I believe, it went to trial and, there was some jail time in that because the amount was in the millions. And so
Wow.
quite drastic.
Yeah, well, and that's obviously not the typical case that I get involved in, but part of the reason why I ask how she responded and is because, and I say this all the time, if you suspect somebody of is guilty of misconduct, when you're assessing whether you have just cause to fire them, it's not just the misconduct itself; it's a whole bunch of factors, including how they respond. Are they apologetic? Do they give you some reassurance it was an aberration, it won't happen again? Or do they basically dig themselves a deeper hole and lie and try to cover it up? And we've seen a lot of those cases where people just keep lying, and now it's not just misconduct; it's also dishonesty. So I was curious about that one, although it sounds like from what you were saying, there really wasn't much for any way for her to try to deny it.
Yeah, I don't think there's any way of hiding behind, $750,000 worth of fraud on corporate cards when it's finally found out.
Yeah.
So I think it was one of those head down moments. You're caught, and now you have to face the music.
Yeah. Although even I've seen situations. I'm not sure if we had the $750,000 mark, but significant theft. In one case in particular that I can't talk about in detail, but it was a case where there was substantial amounts of theft, and like this case, there was no denying it. But basically, what the guy literally broke down and started talking about how his marriage had broken down. He was going through a divorce. All his money was going to legal fees. He was drinking. He was seeing a therapist, and he was just utterly apologetic. And I saw the video of the interview. He was utterly, I mean, humiliated, apologetic, assuring the company would never ever happen again. And that was one of those interesting ones where it didn't end up going to court. But if it did, I could see a lot of judges looking at this and saying, yeah, clearly there was misconduct and clearly some form of discipline was appropriate, but summary dismissal or dismissal for cause would have been too harsh. So that's a lesson I always try to convey to people is even if you've caught the person dead to rights, so to speak, doesn't mean you can fire them. Anyways, I'll bring it back to your niche and the corporate credit card fraud. I'm not going to say that too many times. So what other interesting scenarios have you seen?
Yeah, a couple of interesting ones I've seen in one role that I had in particular. One of I believe it was a sales rep was using a corporate card to pay for their wedding, essentially. So there's a
Wow.
bunch of purchases that were happening at different venues, the venue that they were having the wedding reception at and things like that. And it tallied up to about $7,000 or $8,000 worth of purchases that were actually fraudulent, had nothing to do with business whatsoever, but were being put through the corporate Amex, so to speak. And that's where it gets really hairy when you start sort of digging in and trying to figure out, is fraud happening? Is it not happening? Because in a lot of cases, some of the purchases will look legitimate, right? It's a
Right.
restaurant
Yeah.
or something along those lines. And then you have to do some element of due diligence of looking at the date, looking at where that person was supposed to be, looking at if there were customers involved or not, or clients involved or not. And so there's an element of investigation needs to happen if you have an inclination of fraud happening. And as leaders, unfortunately for us, in a lot of ways, at least when it comes to like physical cards and things like that, you're relying on kind of gut instinct to figure out if something actually is nefarious or not, which is kind of subjective in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and I think that's the trouble. And this actually came up in a discussion recently where, let's say there's a charge on the credit card from Amazon, right? That could be office supplies or it could be my child's toy for the holidays. And you have no idea what it is by looking at the credit card. Or interestingly, just as you were talking, you reminded me of another case I worked on a number of years ago now, where our client had a salesperson and our client covered his gas. He would charge the gas on his personal credit card and then expense it and be reimbursed. And just, they started to get suspicious. I guess someone started to look at the credit card statement in more detail and realized that he had bought gas, full tanks of gas twice within about 3 hours, about 300 kilometers apart. And didn't take too much investigating to figure out that one was his spouse. And then they went back and realized that he'd been doing that for months, if not years. But I guess this brings me to, as you've said, all the examples we're talking about were discovered somewhat haphazardly or by coincidence. But what's the better way to have systems in place to detect these things?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And that you hit the nail on the head. It's very haphazardly. And one great example that you just brought up is our Amazon purchases. Like it could be anything, right? Um, not to tout on Rippling too much, but one of the reasons we're in business is to kind of help prevent some of this stuff, right? Part of our spend management is actually supplying corporate cards for businesses that are Rippling customers. And our corporate cards are digital, right? So it's a little bit different than your traditional plastic corporate card. And the reason that's different, the reason it's better in a lot of ways for businesses to kind of manage and prevent fraud from happening is you can actually be very prescriptive in what those cards are used for, right down to the dollar amount, right down to the type of vendor you're allowed to use them for. So as an example, I have 4 or 5 different corporate cards through Rippling, and they're all used for different things and are very specific and have very specific dollar values. And the reason that exists and the reason we do it that way is to prevent some of this stuff from happening. So as an example, one of my cards I can use for Amazon because I purchase gift cards and things like that for either employees or customers or what have you. But the other 4 cards cannot be used at Amazon for any reasons. The second I try to use that card at Amazon, no, declined. It will not work. It could
Right.
work somewhere else. And the reason we do that is just to kind of prevent that type of fraud from happening. So there's definitely a better way of doing it in this day and age, which is using sort of digital cards that are less susceptible to misuse because you can lock them down so easily.
Right. Yeah, I love, when we were talking last week, I love the concept. And as you were saying to me, I mean, it sounds like it can be great for larger organizations, but you were saying, smaller, mid-sized companies are using them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of our biggest growth engines right now is in the SMB market, where it's, customers that have 10 to 50 employees roughly that have a need for, business cards or corporate cards for their employees. A lot of them, are sales reps that are either out on the road or executives that are taking folks out for, different events and things like that. There's lots of businesses that are small that have this type of requirement. And the same holds true for the small businesses as it does for the large businesses. Fraud can happen anywhere, and I've seen it happen even in small businesses where people are putting personal items on corporate cards and getting away with it because no one has the true oversight on what is being purchased and why. And quite frankly, once you reach 50, 100 employees plus, it's pretty cumbersome to go through bank statements and credit card statements all the time and make sure like every single line item is accounted for. Most corporate controllers and finance departments tend to somewhat be decentralized, especially in some bigger businesses. And a lot of it, the time you see like sort of rubber stamp, right? Like the corporate card comes
Right.
in and then they rubber stamp it and approve it. There's not a ton of oversight on that. And so that's why we've we've come up with the digital corporate cards where it's, you can be very prescriptive. This is what it can be used for. This is what it cannot be used for. And this is where it can be used. And it
Right.
just cuts down on that amount of fraud that happens.
Yeah. And that sounds like a great tool from the preventative approach, where, as you said, you can't use certain cards and certain vendors or types of vendors. But what about on the detection side? Like, does that help or make it easier to detect fraud?
Yeah, absolutely. You're only as good as your data, and I think that's where Rippling really shines. We're able to surface data fairly easily, and so one of the things that when you're using a digital corporate card is you can actually set very specific policies around like what the cards can be used for. So even if somebody does use a card in an area where they're not supposed to, and that payment actually goes through, the purchase actually works because it hasn't been locked down to, a specific vendor, as an example. It'll still be flagged as, either out of policy because the purchase was over a certain dollar amount, or it was purchased in a vendor that is not necessarily approved, even though the payment went through. And so there's checks and balances there that you can look for fairly easily on our digital platform, and you'll see, a little asterisk around a specific purchase. And everything has to be approved eventually. So as a leader for myself, I have a bunch of folks on my team. All of them have corporate cards. Every single time they submit an expense, it goes into the system, and then I have to actually go in, physically look at the purchase, match the receipt, make sure everything is there and checks out, and then I can hit approve. If it's not approved, then the onus is actually back on the employee to pay that amount.
Okay, and so that's interesting, because that it sounds like a lot of tedious work for you. But whatever size organization we're talking about, how often is that happening, where someone is not only looking at the credit card invoice, but looking at the specific invoices and checking details? Because I could be wrong. I'm assuming that doesn't happen a lot, and usually it's just a rubber stamp, like you were saying.
Yeah, I don't think it happens a lot today in a lot of businesses. I think, the platforms that exist today are kind of cumbersome. They don't make it simple and easy to look at something and know right away whether it's in policy or not. The great thing about Rippling is it's very simple. You see a receipt, you see the purchase, you make sure it matches up, the vendor is approved, and then you just click OK. So for me, it's actually not as cumbersome as it may sound or may seem. But it's actually it's quite simple to go in and do approvals as long as they're within policy. And it's very easy for me to run a report as well to see any out of policy expenses that are being submitted as well.
Cool. Okay, and what about businesses who are using the old school credit card? So what would you suggest that they do to try to detect the inappropriate use?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think my first gut reaction is switch to digital as soon as can, because that'll just make your life easier. But a lot of it is just being very judicious in looking at statements and making sure that the purchases that are being made are within, your company's policy. And I think that is the bigger thing here is you actually have to have a very prescriptive policy around your corporate cards, what it can be used for, what it cannot be used for, and be very, very cut and dry with it. I think that, from your perspective, from a legal perspective, the more cut and dry you can be with your actual policy around corporate cards and purchases and allocating business funds, the easier it'll be to either, go through the process of, terminating somebody if they do misuse the corporate cards or not, because it is very black and white in a lot of ways on the policy. No matter how apologetic somebody wants to be, if they blatantly go outside that policy, then they should have some sort of uh, punishment around that.
Right. Yeah. And a lot of times, like I was saying, it doesn't mean there's no punishment, but it's some form of discipline as opposed to dismissal. But you made an interesting point I wanted to come back to on policies, because most of the expense policies I see, whether it's in someone's contract or in a policy handbook, essentially says you'll be you will be reimbursed for reasonable business expenses. It might say expenses over X dollars must be pre-approved. And then if the person does any driving, it'll say that, mileage will be reimbursed at X dollars per kilometer or in accordance with CRA or something like that. But that's the extent of most of the policies that I see. So is there more that you would suggest be put right into a policy?
Yeah, I think that term reasonable business expenses lets people kind of wiggle out of things.
Lawyers love terms like that.
Yeah, of course. I think the term reasonable is probably the thing that people hold on to is like what is reasonable, and you sort of almost have to define what reasonable is within the policy. Reasonable can be, taking a customer out for dinner and then having a specific dollar amount, per diem per person that is that you're able to submit as an expense. As an example, $75 per person, for a dinner and going out. A lot of policies don't have that. They don't have sort of prescription around the amount that you can spend, or if, as you said, if it's over a certain dollar threshold, more approvals are needed, which I think is important. I think you should always have those checks and balances, but getting as prescriptive as like, hey, this is your actual per diem amount that you can submit for this type of expense would go a long way. I think, business expenses as opposed to reasonable business expenses is probably something that most companies should look at maybe removing from their policy.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, although, it just creates the next question of, well, then what do you say? Because you can't cover every scenario, but I think your point is a good one. The more detail you can put in, whether it's a maximum for a lunch, a maximum for a dinner, maximum for a client gift, the more detail you can include, the better. And of course, there's always that discretion to approve something more. But I agree with you, and I think that's where I think we might see policies evolving over the next little while, is to include more of that detail that we don't see now. So I'm sort of jumping a bit here, but getting back to investigations for a second. So let's say I'm a small business owner, and I just have this concern. I have this suspicion that someone is putting things on the company credit card that are really personal. And I know every case is a little bit different, but from what you've seen and lived through, what's the typical process from that point on?
Yeah, that's a great question. What I have seen be fairly effective is one, going through the actual statement itself for the corporate card and identifying any purchases that may be outside of the policy or ones that you have a gut instinct around that are just not kind of business purchases. And then, either one, contacting the vendor and validating what was purchased that day. That's one way you can go about it. The second way, and I think the more effective way, is sitting down with the employee and going through the statement and asking them what was purchased on those dates and why. And so I think that that second part will shine a light pretty quickly on the fact that you as a business owner or business operator are keeping on top of the expenses, and you're holding your own employees accountable for how they're using the corporate card. And very quickly you'll know if somebody is lying or being nefarious in their use of the corporate card if you call out, hey, what was this purchase for and who is it for on this and this date. I think the other side of this, going back to what we were just talking about a second ago, is around policies, is making sure that if you do take somebody out for a customer dinner, as an example, that all the people who attended that dinner, email addresses, names, what have you, are identified. Because that way you can always go back if there is any sort of question whether or not this purchase was valid or not. You can actually validate who was involved in that and say, hey, yes, this customer was actually part of that dinner. And you can ask that directly.
Yeah. Have you seen companies do that where they call or email the client and say, did you go out for dinner with so-and-so on this date?
I have personally done that myself. Yes, I have sent an email or two in my day, just making sure that they actually indeed attended that event when they were listed on the expense.
And did they?
They did. Yes, they did. Although I have seen instances, not directly with myself, but where people were put on expenses and we're not part of that, and so that's a whole different conversation.
Yeah, well, and that's a great example of what I was talking about earlier. Like at that point, it's not just the fraud; it's also the dishonesty. And especially, I mean, one case that I saw where I think the employee knew that the company was starting to suspect, so he actually started calling clients who were friends, or I think in that case it was potential clients, and
Yeah.
saying, if you hear anything from my company, tell them that we went out for dinner and I was trying to pitch our business to you. So now it's not just misconduct; it's also dishonesty as well, which it makes an even stronger argument to terminate someone.
Yeah, absolutely. And now you're bringing people into the fold that, shouldn't necessarily be involved with whatever you're doing. So it's never a good thing.
Yeah, no, that's definitely not. And it's interesting just to kind of close the loop on something I've mentioned a few times. I've said that, you don't just look at the misconduct, you look at all the relevant factors, including things like how long the person's been employed, have they been in trouble before, but also the nature of their job. And the case that I mentioned in my opening was from, I believe, last year or early this year, involved Galaxy Motors. And long story short, it was the general manager of this car dealership. And there were two expenses for dinners, and it was not a lot of money, maybe a couple $100. But in both cases, he'd taken out his wife for dinner and expensed it as a legitimate business expense. The interesting thing is he was fired. That case actually went all the way to trial, which of course most never do, and the dismissal was upheld. And I think, reading between the lines, if it was an average employee, the court probably would have said, yeah, this was offside. There should have been some sort of discipline. But because this was a general manager, he was
Mhm.
held to a higher standard. And even these two instances were enough to destroy the relationship and justify termination for cause. So that's a great example of how it's not just the misconduct in question. You're looking at a bunch of other factors as well.
Yeah,
But that's
absolutely.
me. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I know, absolutely. I think, once you have a certain level of titling and a certain responsibility, fiduciary responsibility to a business, you're held to a much different standard than even, folks who are just individual contributors.
Yeah, and that's where I think it's also important for employers to know it's not one size fits all. So if there was another employee who did the exact same thing, but had a perfectly clean record, had been with the company for 20 years, and was in a lower level position, it probably wouldn't have been just cause for dismissal. So, so as we said repeatedly before the show, time flies by. So before I let you go, any final words?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's been wonderful, wonderful chat. I mean, corporate card fraud is near and dear to my heart, and also to our business here at Rippling, trying to prevent, businesses from spending more money than they should. Thank you very much for bringing me on. If anybody does want to learn more about Rippling, you can always visit us at rippling.com/en-ca. Around corporate cards, you can just hit /corporate cards and find out more.
Perfect. I was about to ask how people can reach you, but you anticipated my question. So thank you, Alex, so much for joining us. Great conversation. Corporate card fraud is near and dear to your heart. Terminations is near and dear to mine. So we obviously can have some great conversations. But thanks again for doing this.
Thanks, Stuart. Appreciate it.
All right, now I will take my turn to fire away. So I'm picking up on the discussion from season 7, episode 10 of Fire Away, where we talked about corporate credit card fraud. And my rant today really is about too many employers just discover misconduct and immediately rush to judgment and to fire the employee, especially when we're talking about things like theft or fraud. And I think employment lawyers are always saying this: you've got to proceed with caution. The concept of fire first and ask questions later is not a good idea in the context of employment law, and it can lead to significant liability. So I agree, corporate credit card theft or any theft or fraud is serious. I don't want to undermine that, but never rush to judgment. And remember, and I've said this a million times on Fireway, in my book, and countless blogs and everything else, when you're going to fire someone, and when I say fire someone, that means termination for cause, which means they don't get any notice, any termination pay, any severance pay, or anything. When you're going to fire someone, you have to prove two things. One, that there was misconduct, but two, that the relationship has been irreparably harmed. And the key point here is that when a court is looking at that, they're not looking at the misconduct in isolation. They're going to take what's called the contextual approach. They're going to look at things like, how long was the person employed? Do they have a prior history of discipline? What's the nature of their role or the degree of trust required? And we talked about that in season 7, episode 10 of Fire Away, where a general manager was held to a much higher standard than someone in a lower level position would have been. And the other key factor, and what I find is often the determining factor, how the employee responds when they're confronted. If they are dishonest, if they try to cover it up, if they basically give you no reason to think it's not going to happen again, it's far more likely a court's going to say that the relationship has been irreparably harmed. If they are apologetic, if they give you assurances that it's not going to happen again, and especially if they've got a clean record, In many cases, the court will say that they deserve another chance, and some lesser form of discipline will be appropriate. So the investigation is key. You need to investigate, first of all, to confirm your suspicion. Make sure that whatever you think this person did, make sure they actually did it. Because I have seen cases where it seemed to be the case, but upon further investigation, it wasn't. Even if you do confirm that they did it, find out if there are mitigating factors. Is there an addiction issue, a mental health issue? Has there been past condemnation of this type of conduct before? You want to know those before you fire the person, not later, and certainly not when you're going through a litigation on a wrongful dismissal claim. And then how does the employee respond? And I have a lot of clients push back on this and say, I know they're just going to lie. They're going to try to cover it up. And like I always say, and I've said it already today, if they do, they're digging themselves a deeper hole, because now not only are they guilty of misconduct, they're guilty of dishonesty. And that makes your case for saying this relationship has been irreparably harmed even stronger. If you get it wrong, you're going to be on the hook not only for full severance, but also your legal costs, their legal costs, and potentially additional damages if a court thinks that you acted in good faith. So you need to investigate first to avoid all those things. And last point before I wrap this rant up, that doesn't mean do nothing. If you suspect someone is guilty of misconduct, you want to put them on administrative leave, not a suspension, because suspension is disciplinary, and that suggests you've already judged them to be guilty. Put them on a suspension, then you investigate, and then you decide on the best course of action. The most common mistake I make is I see companies say, well, we're really busy now. We've got a trade show coming up. I'm going to wait till the busy season ends. Then we'll deal with it. And you then can let the person continue working with you. Remember that to justify just cause, you have to convince a court that the relationship has been irreparably harmed, that you could not continue to employ them. If you literally continue to employ them, then you're just undermining your argument. So you want to immediately put them on administrative leave, do the investigation, then determine where to go from here. So as I always say, before you take any action, get advice from someone who specializes in employment law. If you think you might need an employment lawyer, you probably do. That's a wrap for season 7, episode 10 of Fire Away. Our next episode, last of 2024, is going to be on December 17th. And most of the Rudner Law team is going to be joining me for a look back at the highlights of 2024 and what might be on the radar for 2025. So tune into that. And if you have any questions about employment law you want us to answer, feel free to send them in using any of our social media channels. Thank you to everyone for tuning in today. Thank you in particular for Alex Gonçalves for joining me for a great conversation. Thanks as always to Rob and Rebecca and Mark for putting the show together. And to quote my favorite hockey broadcaster, the pleasure has been all ours.
At Rudner Law, we want people to treat their employment relationships as legal relationships and make informed decisions rather than assumptions. Keep up to date on Canadian employment law issues by following us on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and TikTok, liking our Facebook page, subscribing to our YouTube channel, and signing up for our newsletter. Past episodes can be found on YouTube, on our website, and archived on Facebook. And if you like our page or subscribe to our channel, you will receive notifications when the episodes are live. As we always say, none of that replaces legal advice tailored to your specific circumstances. If you think you might need an employment lawyer, you probably do. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us.